Walking a path along the roots of Pikes Peak, you take a fork in the road to the Anslem Society Digital Pub. Inside is a raucous conversation on the arts, faith, and who exactly would be on the Anslem Society Mount Rushmore of authors. At a corner table by the fire are three people. One of them is making an impassioned case for both Jane Austen and G.K. Chesterton. And that's me, Matthew Mellema. And welcome to Believe to See, a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. Here at Believe to See, we explore the relationship between faith, art, and storytelling. Our goal is to help you connect the great story, the great stories, and our own stories in order to understand what it means to live with a Christian imagination. So let me bring in my co-host right now, Mandy Hauk. Mandy, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I am doing very well. So I have been thinking about Anselm Mount Rushmore, so you know, the four quintessential folks.
Yes, I'm familiar.
Before I get, and I'm going to talk about this more in just a bit, but before we do, who is your four?
Well, I mean,
by the way, I just ambushed with her. I gave her no warning. I would ask her this.
Oh, do you ever? No, you do not. But I think one is kind of obvious since my cat bears his name. So I would say C.S. Lewis.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a very big Dorothy Sayers.
Oh, that's a good
person.
one. That's a good one.
So I think if I'm only allowed to pick two, I'll pick those two. And they can hang out up there with Austen and Chesterton. Although we know we would get in big trouble if we didn't include Tolkien, because this is Anselm.
Wow, you say it like you wouldn't on your own, and I am scandalized by that, but I'm going to overlook it.
Oh, with Tolkien?
Yeah.
Oh, no, I love Tolkien, but Lewis beats Tolkien in my brain.
Well, I feel like we can have that debate. Those are the two obvious ones. So then the other two slots are kind of open. I think you can make an argument for G.K. Chesterton. I would argue for Jane Austen, obviously. Then I think Dorothy Sayers is good. We could go Dante. I think
that's possible. I'm sorry. Well, no, never mind. I was going to say I would bump Austen for Sayers, but I don't know.
Well,
this is a whole other podcast, Matt.
Well,
I don't know.
Well, regardless, I hope our listeners will be stewing on this too. And regardless of who is on your individual list, I think there is one name that, if we're all being honest, has to be on there, right? It's a given, and that person is C.S. Lewis. And if you're the sort of person who's listening to this podcast, then there's about a 115% chance that you are familiar with the works of C.S. Lewis. And let me also add tangentially that if you're listening to this podcast and you're not familiar with him, please shoot me an email, because you're an interesting person and I'd love to get to know you better. But for the rest of us, we all have, the standard playlist of his greatest hits. There's Screwtape Letters, Mere Christianity, Till We Have Faces, and of course, Chronicles of Narnia. But what if I told you that Lewis's life story was just as compelling as his literary work? Our guest today is an author and teacher at Northwind Seminary, and he's here to make exactly that argument. He holds both a DMin in spiritual formation and an MA in history. And as is particularly relevant for us today, he has an abiding love and fascination with the work and life of C.S. Lewis. He's written a brand new book with Moody Publishers. It's called Not a Tame Lion: The Life, Teachings, and Legacy of C.S. Lewis. He's Terry Glaspey, and we are thrilled that he can join us at the table. Welcome, Terry.
It's such a pleasure to be here. I wish we could hang out with the 4 or 5 other names that you mentioned. I'd probably want to invite George MacDonald to.
That's a good one.
Come along.
Oh, of course.
We need a little, MacDonald action going here, but. All those are great writers and people who've meant so much to me along my spiritual journey. Yeah.
Now, George MacDonald is a good one. We, because obviously C.S. Lewis viewed him as sort of his mentor / master as a writer. We actually had a George MacDonald special theme night last year. It was super, super fun. So that was a really good one. But let's talk about the man of the hour, C.S. Lewis. Let's talk about your personal history with him. How did you first encounter his work, and what initially stuck out to you about it?
Okay, well, that's a really interesting question. So, um, I was kind of born into a home that we went to church, and faith was part of my life growing up, and eventually somewhere along the line about junior high, I kind of made it my own. And then I decided when it was time to go to college, I would go to Bible college. And the interesting thing was, it was while I was at Bible college that I became full of questions about my faith. My heart and my mind both filled with a lot of questions about, is this really the answer to life? Are these and I found that a lot of times, both in my church and sometimes even the Bible college, when I'd ask hard questions, nobody really wanted to deal with them. It was kind of like, oh, don't make us uncomfortable here. And so it's like my faith was in a kind of a rocky place there for a while. And someone suggested that I might try reading books by C.S. Lewis. And so I thought, okay, we'll do that. And first book I read was Mere Christianity, which probably is the gateway drug for a lot of Lewis addicts. And immediately I was just my heart was warmed and my mind was challenged both at the same time. Um, Somebody talks about Lewis having a feeling intellect. I love that phrase, and that is what I felt immediately as I began to read his books. And so he began to, answer some questions for me, and really give me a vision for what the Christian life was actually meant to be. And this just I'll say this much: the second book I read was a very different one by Lewis, and that was The Great Divorce, which I literally sat down on the couch at home with the book and started reading, and I didn't get up off the couch until I was finished. And that introduced me to a whole other side of C.S. Lewis, the very creative storytelling side of Lewis. And so ever since, I have been one of those whose life doesn't feel like it would be quite the same without Lewis being part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, I was struck when I was reading your introduction in this book. It sounds like Lewis really. Would you say that he saved your faith? Is that overstating it, or?
Well, it's not far from that would not be far from an overstatement. That's for certain. I was really filled with a lot of questions, and he was the first one to give me answers that really felt like they made sense, like they spoke not only to my mind but to my heart as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and related to that, one of the things that stuck out to me about your answer just now was the concept of the feeling intellect. And I think, I can think back to times in my life, I'm guessing most of us can, where you are racked with all these doubts. And we often think of doubts as like intellectual puzzles, but really 99% of the time, doubts are going to be a combination of both intellect and heart issues. Like you mentioned, I believe in your introduction, how there were these head issues, but they're also like, oh, there's hypocrisy in the church. There's all these other things that are more matters of the heart.
Yeah.
Did that seem to make C.S. Lewis uniquely situated that he can speak to both at the same time to the person dealing with doubt?
I've never found any other writer who does both quite so well as he does. I mean, it's interesting. A lot of people, when they think of Lewis, they think of him as mostly as like the defender of faith. And that is something that he does well. And, we can talk more about that if you want to at some point. But he's very good at giving answers that make sense. But if we saw that as all there was to Lewis, I think we've missed out on possibly the most important part of Lewis, which is the way through imagination. He really speaks to the whole person. Um, I mean, if you ask people, for example, how did you become a Christian? There are very few people, I think, who are going to give the answer, well, I lost an argument, right? And the reason
That's an
I
excellent
think
point.
the
Yeah.
reason we become a Christian, the reason we embrace this faith is because it gives us an entirely different vision for who God is, what the world is about, where meaning is situated, and who we are. And I
Mhm.
think that Lewis is someone who does such a powerful job of casting that vision, and that vision is there's an intellectual element to it, and that's important, but it also is so much bigger than that. It's a world we want to
Yeah.
inhabit.
Yeah, and I was thinking about, I think something that's unique about this book is it's a biography, but it's also about his teachings. I mean, the subtitle, wherever I put the title page, the subtitle is very accurate. The life, teachings, and legacy. There you go. And I was really struck by, you really explore how um, the pattern of his life really informed um, how his faith grew. Like a recurring theme in his life is longing. Like it's whenever the longing, and you talk a lot about that in the book. And I think it's also, and of course Lewis talked a lot about it. But I think something that's unique about him is he was so unashamed to be honest about his doubts and his longings, and he just laid them all out there. And maybe that is part of what makes him unique in the way you were just saying, that he gets to our hearts with his writing. So what would you say about specifically, like, how do you think his longings and the difficulties he went through in his life, how they informed his whole path and his
Yeah,
faith?
that is such a good question. I think such an important question for really thinking about who Lewis is and what makes him unique. I mean, if you read books like Miracles and The Problem of Pain and Mere Christianity, you might think that the way Lewis became a Christian was he investigated all the arguments and eventually was compelled by the arguments to where it's like, well, I have to become a Christian. It's the only intellectual possibility. And as you actually get into his life, that's not the case at all. What led him to faith was exactly those sort of longings that he felt in his heart for something more that he couldn't quite put his head and his heart around, and yet that longing is what cracked open the door that faith would fill. I mean, if we talked about George MacDonald earlier, and George MacDonald had such an important part in his conversion. He was in a train station waiting for a train that was overdue, and he stepped in and was looked over a pile of used books that were available, and one caught his attention. It was a book called Fantastes, and um, when he started to read, he bought it and started to read it, and he found that not only was the train overdue, but his life was overdue. His life was overdue for something powerful and life changing. And he says that book, as he read it, literally baptized his imagination. It was what really, more than anything else, set him on the pathway to faith. And when you read the book, it's not a book of theology. It's not a book of spiritual devotions or somebody's testimony. It's this kind of wacky, in some ways, fantasy story that is full of all this romantic imagery that we have to kind of ponder to really try to get to the bottom of. And it doesn't speak primarily to the head, but it speaks to the heart. And that was what cracked open the door for him, I think.
Well, yeah, I actually have the page in your book open right now where you talk about that. And I love the quote that you shared that Lewis's statement about having read that book. He said, quote, "I did not yet know, and I was long in learning, the name of the new quality, the bright shadow. I do now, it was holiness."
Mm.
And so really it's just that he was touched by that other.
That other. Yeah. That's the perfect word for it, Mandy.
Yay me.
The other. That, yeah.
Yeah.
And that the other was not only other, but the other had a sense of holiness. There was something about there was something from another realm that threw a transformative light on everything in this world. And he first glimpsed that in the book, and then later on realized that what that shadow was all about is that was our God, the God who was up in Jesus. Yeah.
And I just think it is so fascinating that again, the sort of first step in baptizing his imagination was Phantastes. Because again, I think there is this conception of Lewis that a lot of, very well-meaning folks hold, that picture him as sort of this, like logic machine, right? The like you said, the defender of the faith. And he was a very rigorous thinker, and he was trained in philosophy to a great extent, but that was hardly the full extent of his thought. And again, Phantastes, I read it, and I read a lot of it thinking, what? It's a very strange book. It's a beautiful book. I'm glad I read it, but there aren't any like propositional matters of theology discussed there. It's sort of a jaunt through this crazy imaginary fairy world. But that was the first thing that did it for him. So my question for you, you mentioned earlier about how the way to speak to the whole person was through the imagination. And I'm wondering what that means in terms of C.S. Lewis's professional training, because C.S. Lewis was, he was a scholar of medieval and Renaissance literature. He wrote some well-regarded academic works on the subject. And he would often talk about how that sort of quality was present back then, but had been lost by his day. Do you feel like that his research into those authors had any contribution to his view of like the whole person imagination?
Oh, I think so. I mean, if you look at who he took the time to write books about, like Edmund Spenser with the Fairy Queen, and that his first Christian book was modeled after John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, and he called his The Pilgrim's Regress, and told he basically told his conversion story in allegorical kind of forms in that book. I mean, this is who he was, and it's interesting that if people think about Lewis, they think about mere Christianity and the arguments for faith, and they think about the Chronicles of Narnia and this childlike world, and this is the man. This is what makes him so absolutely wonderful. I mean, he's somebody who really in his lifetime never spent much time around children. It was pretty limited, his exposure to children. How could he write these childlike stories that had such an impact on children? Well, it's because that's who he was. He had a childlike joy, and he had a childlike sense of wonder. I think Lewis had the curiosity of a child, which is something I think all of us hopefully can at some point in our lives rediscover a little bit of that curiosity and wonder of the child. And I think that is that's what we see in him. That's what he found, that the God he worshipped, that he came to believe in. What the God was in a certain sense childlike, which is something Chesterton often refers to.
Yeah, there's this great line from, I'm probably going to butcher the quote, but Chesterton was talking about how you can see the life in children where they'll go up to an adult, be like, "Hey, toss me there again and again and again and again," and then the line was,
Oh, the again.
We have sinned and grown old, and our Father is younger than we."
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. I mean, that he has the he has that youthful wonder about him, that he would create daisies, and every daisy he creates is not like stamped out like like out of a machine. No, every daisy is unique. Every
Right.
daisy is its own thing. So
Well, and that kind of takes me back to, that's another thing that he was unashamed about. He was not he not just unashamed to be honest about his doubts, but he was also unashamed of being curious. And typically when we think of scholars, we tend to think of people who are very sure. And they are kind of honed in on their discipline, and that's their obsession, and that's what they are sure of, and that's what they debate about and argue about. But it's like, I don't know, I'm sorry, I'm speaking as I'm thinking, so who knows, but I feel like he just kind of held on to his sureness very loosely, and kind of allowed himself to not know, and like he kind of reveled in the not knowing.
Yeah. I mean, I think the two greatest weaknesses of the academic world are that sense of the certainty, which means I'm not asking questions anymore. Now I'm the professor who's going
Yes.
to give you the benefit of all my wisdom, and that part of the way you climb in the academic world is by being the expert in this one little tiny thing, and you lose sight of the vision of all of reality. It's kind of like, experts say that I've doing some reading on this recently, that it's like the left side of our brain tends to be the part of our brain that focuses on the detail, that wants to get everything completely figured out, nailed down. And once it's nailed it down, it's hard to move it. And too much of our culture is like that. Whereas the right brain is all about being aware of everything around us, and context, and how much there is still out there to explore, and how whatever knowledge we have has to fit in this bigger picture. It's, once again, I guess I've used that word several times, but vision. It's about vision.
Yeah.
Yeah, and related to this, you touched on it just a little bit, but one of the many things Lewis would do is he'd, critique his own age, talk about like trends he saw in his age and sort of like think about what they would be going forward. Do you believe there are any things that you'd see in the world around us now that are basically the fruits of the things that Lewis warned us about?
Well, I mean, one of Lewis's great books is The Abolition of Man, and in The Abolition of Man, which, we could do a whole session talking about The Abolition of Man, because I mean, it's such a brilliant look at the fact that we have lost sight of the things that really matter, the things that are really of the greatest value. Lewis says at one point, we are men without chests. And what he was using that word chest in kind of like a synonym for being without the heart, that that we live by our head, we live by our belly, by our desires. And it's like the place our chest is where we integrate, where we pull it all together. And I think as a culture, we've tended to become kind of split between and pulled apart by these two like competing things, which is the world of thought and intellect and trying to get everything nailed down, and the world of pleasure and satiating all our desires. And that Lewis thought that there was a bigger and better way to live. So I think I'm ranting now. So
No, hey, that's what this is. That's what we're doing together here. This is fine. That actually, when you were, one thing I think, and this is well known about Lewis, is how important his friendships were. And I think that kind of goes into what you're talking about. Like it seemed like he knew that we were created for the longings that we have were given to us. And one very important longing is the longing for friendship and companionship. Yeah. And he had who were the key, the lifelong ones. I mean, there's the brother.
Yeah, well, I mean, and the interesting thing is all the people who were his closest friends throughout his life were people who were in some ways very like him, but in other ways very much unlike him. And I think it was that fascination of the people who were different. I mean, his brother Warren was quite different from him, and yet they had this close relationship. Owen Barfield, who wasn't actually even a Christian by the normal definition of the word, but he was somebody Lewis loved, and so Lewis loved to talk about ideas with. And Tolkien, a great friend, but a very different personality. And Charles Williams, who was full of just fascinating ways of thinking about the Christian life that were definitely outside the box. And Lewis loved that. So, you're absolutely right that I think Lewis chose friends who would help him along the path, not just people who would go, oh, yeah, you're right about everything, but people who would be challenging him and causing him to think differently. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and related to that, I'm curious what you think about his approach in interacting with both his friends or the rest of the world in terms of this splitting of something that was integrated. Like you mentioned earlier, with the Men Without Chess, splitting things into the thought and the intellect on one hand, and on the other hand, like the feelings, pleasures, and desires on the other. And any of us can see these sort of dichotomies that have been created and now are everywhere, where you'll see, quote unquote Christians who are huge jerks online because they just care about truth, and people who, just care about emotions and go the other way. Yeah, exactly. So Lewis, yeah, exactly. So Lewis was in situations where he was around folks who, it sounds like, had a lot of disagreements with him, but was able to forward both of those without being loveless and dogmatic or just letting his emotions run rampant. So what was, from what you saw, what was his approach?
To be fair, one thing we have to say about Lewis is he actually loved a good argument. He just, he found great joy in argument, and he was known for being someone who would just totally get in, especially over a beer, would get into a really great argument. But he always did it with respect. I was recently talking to a group of writers about the things that I think make Lewis uniquely powerful as a writer. And I said, well, one is his clarity, the fact that he writes so in such a way we can clearly understand what he's trying to say. That's important to him. He defines things along the way, lets us know where we're going. His creativity, the fact that he uses his imagination so powerfully. But I think the third element that's so important, and in any good sermon-like thing, you have to have 3 matching letters to start with, right? So I'm going to say the third C is courtesy. He's a very
Oh.
courteous writer. He helps us along. I think that's why we enjoy reading him so much, is that the man himself comes through in the books, and that he is someone who has the courtesy to respect where his reader is at, not try to force things down their throat, not to look down on the reader, but to actually assume that the reader is as smart as he is, which in every case probably is not true. But I
Right.
love that he
I,
treats me
yeah.
that way as a writer. And
Yeah. One
yeah.
of, oh,
And I
go.
was just going to say, and maybe I've been thinking a little bit about Lewis as a as a communicator to postmodernism, which I think
Mm.
is something that Lewis does so well. I think that's one of the reasons why he's continued to be so popular, is that, yeah, he can speak to the person who wants to have an argument about facts and philosophies, but he also speaks through narrative and through story and through finding this other way. And I think that's part of the courtesy of meeting his audience where they're at and casting a vision for a new way of thinking about things. So.
Yeah. The first nonfiction book of his that I read was Letters to
Oh,
Malcolm,
yes, yes.
and definitely has that courtesy. And I just remember, because I mean, I read the Chronicles of Narnia the first time. I think I was in first grade when I tackled them, and then I don't know how many times I've read them since then. But to encounter his voice as Jack, in Letters to Malcolm was just such a it was just such a pleasurable, cozy almost, even though like you said, he would obviously so much smarter than me, but it didn't feel that way. It felt like the gentleness and the courtesy, as you said. It's just, there's warmth. That's the word I'm going for. There's a warmth there, which you typically don't associate with intellect. And yet there it
Yeah,
was.
I like the
So,
word you use, cozy. That,
oh,
I think there actually is something. There's something inviting about books,
mm-hmm.
right? And I
Yeah.
really think if we think about the authors who we most love to read, who are our favorite
Mm-hmm.
authors, the reason they're our favorite authors almost always is because we would want to spend time with them, which is
Mhm.
what we do in the book
Absolutely.
when we read their book, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Lewis is inviting. He's as inviting as, depending on your proclivities, a good cup of hot tea, or a pint of dark ale. You know,
Yeah.
he wants you to be invited into this exploration that he's doing of ideas and truth, and we love to go back again and again and again. And I always feel like I've never exhausted Lewis. Every time I read it, I find different things.
Well, and that actually makes me wonder, like, because this is not your first book. Hopefully, we'll get a chance to talk about some of your other books as well. But did this one differ as far as your experience in writing it, just because of that affection that you have for him?
Well, I would say that to me, writing this book feels like paying a debt. Now, Lewis
Ah,
is not the only author to whom I'm indebted. There are many authors who've had an impact on my life, but Lewis, in a kind of peculiar way, I don't always agree with Lewis on everything. I don't think Lewis is the fourth member of the Trinity. I know some, Lewis fanboys and fangirls. It almost feels like he's like the Third Testament, Old Testament, New Testament, and then the writings of Lewis. I don't
right.
see him that way, but I do see him as someone who has made an impact on my life and continues to make an impact on my life. There are other writers, like when I was very young, when I was going through my struggles, I read a lot of Francis Schaeffer for a while. And I appreciate Francis Schaeffer, and he had a great impact on me. But I don't go back and reread Francis Schaeffer books now. I feel like I got what I needed out of them. But Lewis's books, they feel like they're inexhaustible to me.
Yeah, another element of C.S. Lewis that you talk about, we already talked about, this combination of warmth and intellect, but another sense that really seems to come through in his writing is this sense of responsibility. Like he has a purpose with his writing to use the gifts that he has, not for himself but for others. How does that come through in the works of C.S. Lewis, and what's your thought about where that sense of responsibility came from?
Um, I think that's a great question. I can't give you chapter or verse or point to a specific passage in any of his books, but I think Lewis felt a calling. I mean, just as a side note, as I bring up in the book, Lewis, as an academic, the thing you want to do in the academic world is climb to a higher and higher status. And Lewis's academic climbing ran into problems because a lot of other academics did not appreciate the fact that he spoke to common people and wrote books for common people. That's just not done. It's not the way you're supposed to do it. You're supposed to write these hard to read books. But I think he felt a calling to share what he learned. And, I think it's easy to talk about Lewis as the defender of the faith, as the great storyteller, but also I really feel like, and this is something someday, maybe a long ways down the road, I'd like to explore more, is thinking more about this idea of what Lewis teaches us about the practical spiritual life and how we live out the practice of being a Christian. And several chapters in the book, I do address that. I mean, I think he's a great writer on things like prayer, dealing with our emotions, dealing with anger, dealing with temptation. I mean, he's got a whole book on that. It's Screw Tape Letters. Because I think for Lewis, the important thing is that faith is not just accepting an idea or a concept, but it's about allowing yourself to be transformed by God. The whole idea of transformation, I think, is so key in so much of Lewis's work. It's about us being willing. God will not force himself upon us. God is a gentleman.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're going to be transformed, we have to learn to be vulnerable to God, and that's a powerful spiritual lesson. Emotion, we emotions are a great thing. For many people, their emotional response to God is kind of the key to their spiritual life. But he says, we have to understand the limits of emotions, that emotions alone don't actually make a very good basis for spiritual maturity. So, and then, like pride, he writes a lot about pride, and that pride is really the central sin. We live in a culture in which being proud and self-confident and all that is that's like the ultimate good. And, I don't think Lewis wants us to have a bad self-image, but Lewis wants us to understand that pride is the basis of our fall. It's what ultimately keeps us away from God, because we don't see our need for him, and we don't see our need to be transformed, which demands humility.
So I'm going to ask a really hard question.
Uh-oh.
And you might not have an answer, But I was just wondering if you have one or two or three favorite C.S. Lewis
Well, that's
books.
kind of like somebody asking somebody who's their favorite child, right?
I thought, yeah.
Ooh, can we maybe do? How about this? How about this, Mandy? Sorry, I'm
Okay,
taking your question, then I'm gonna complicate it. So
Do it.
let's split them into three categories here. So there's what you think his best work is, what your favorite work is, which may not necessarily be the same thing.
Okay.
And then is sort of a bonus one. What's the most underrated one? The one that you feel like doesn't get the attention it deserves.
That's
so let's start.
really wonderful. But I only will agree to do this if we can all
Yes.
do this together.
Oh, okay.
So we each have to answer to that, and I can either go first or I can go last. You tell me what.
Ooh, let's save the guest for last. So I'll start with what I think is his best book.
Okay.
I think his best work is Till We Have Faces. I happened to read that at a time in my life when I was really racked with a lot of doubts, and it was very, very impactful for me. So I am a little biased there, but I feel like it was a very difficult thing to attempt. Taking the viewing the story through this lens of a young woman who C.S. Lewis was not by any stretch, but he pulls it off, and he also is able to grasp. He wrestles with this idea of like the intellect and the feelings, right? The logos and the psyche, and just his ability to wrestle with that, not provide easy answers, but still telling a compelling story, I think is fantastic, and I think it is his best work. All right, Mandy, your turn.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Because it is so masterful. But I will say this is hard, but I'll probably, I don't know. Okay, this is not a final exam. I'm just going to say, I think The Great Divorce, I think, is stunning to me. And it's in a similar way to Till We Have Faces. It's a masterful, creative endeavor, even the way he did that. But I also just love that he put George MacDonald in heaven. It's sort of the opposite of Dante putting all his enemies in hell. So I love The Great Divorce.
Yep. Well, the problem with going last is that you guys took both my number one.
Hey!
I mean, I love the fact I'm getting to talk with people who really know Lewis as probably as well as I do. I think that Till We Have Faces is his greatest literary achievement. It is. It is the book the most full of nuance and rich psychology and complex. It makes you deal with complex ideas and complex emotions. You've got good literature when you don't have like an easy fallback emotion to everything, when it challenges you. So yeah. And then I love The Great Divorce because I think it's his greatest mythic work. Even though I would say that Till We Have Faces is directly like a retelling of a myth, I think the originality of the myth in The Great Divorce is just amazing. And it, like any good myth, it opens up a whole new way of seeing and understanding your world and yourself. Yeah. So, all right, what's next?
All right, next one is our favorite. So mine, I'm actually, my favorite and what I view as the most underrated are actually the same one, because it seems like a lot of folks, we see like the lists of the greatest, C.S. Lewis's greatest works, and Till We Have Faces is mentioned a lot. Another one that is mentioned, and I think C.S. Lewis thought this was one of his best works too, is Paralandra, and it really is really good. I love Paralandra, but this is sort of my quirky opinion. My favorite work of the space trilogy is Out of the Silent Planet. I love the setup of it. I love how it's sort of an old-timey homage to sort of an era of sci-fi. I think that his conception of this world that is unfallen, it was really fascinating. I love the different creatures he has. I love having this sort of the Weston character come in and interact with these beings was so fascinating, and I just loved reading it. I was blown away by it because I hadn't heard of it a lot, and that is also one of the reasons I view it as underrated. Most folks with the Space Trilogy will tell you, justifiably so, that Paralandra's the best, and the one with maybe the craziest is is that Hideous Strength. But for me, for my money, my favorite one is the first one out of the Silent Planet.
Well, that is interesting. You did not take my answer, but I will say of the Space Trilogy, as you were saying that, I think I've read Out of the Silent Planet 3 times, but I've read Paralandra twice, and I've only read that Hideous Strength once, which is probably weird. Okay, I didn't read the series equally, but whatever. But my favorite, and it's a sentimental favorite, but hey, it's my favorite. It's got to be Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Just that one, I'm probably going to cry thinking about it, largely because Eustace Scrubb is one of my favorite characters in all of literature. I have a tattoo that says "Courage, Dear Heart." It's my favorite quote. I've written poetry about that. So, Voyage of the Dawn Treader is just like, it has my heart, just really. So should we do the underrated ones too? Because that's not.
I kind of threw up the nice system. So go ahead and give your underrated one too.
Okay, so for the underrated, I would say Letters from Malcolm, because I never even heard of that one, and I'd heard. I mean, it was the first nonfiction one that I read, but I'd heard all the others. I'd heard of obviously Mere Christianity, Great Divorce, but I hadn't even heard of Letters from Malcolm, and I think a lot of people haven't. So, and I think it's lovely. So, Terry?
So I'm going to completely cheat here and say the Chronicles of Narnia as a whole.
Okay.
And what's really interesting is I had read probably at least half of C.S. Lewis's books before I ever read the Chronicles of Narnia. I did not read them as a child. No one introduced them to me as a child. And I thought to myself, well, I don't know if I really want to waste my time on children's books.
That's my mother is 84 and she has still never read them. And I have told her I'm going to read them to her.
I think that the Chronicles of Narnia, taken as a whole, might be the most profound work of theology written in the 20th century, and I'm putting it right up there with theologians like Karl Barth. I just think that in Narnia we see theology enfleshed, and we see theology as something that is not just in our heads, but it's embodied, and I love those works. And Voyage of the Dawn Treader would definitely be one of my one or two favorites.
Magician's Nephew and Voyage are my two.
I still really love Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. That book means a lot to me.
Well, yes.
And The Horse and His Boy has maybe a couple of my favorite scenes in it are amazing. So I cheated on that. I will say real quickly that on the Space Trilogy, I also think Out of the Silent Planet is my favorite. I'll go on record as not liking Paralandra as much as I'm supposed to. Sorry.
That's okay.
At times it feels almost a little overwritten and overwrought.
Overwrought,
And I think that Hideous Strength, I have very mixed feelings about it. I think it's wonderful storytelling, but it's like C.S. Lewis trying to write a Charles Williams novel. And so it kind of goes in all directions at once, and it's packed full of everything, but it is I mean, it's so relevant for our day that I would overlook anything that I would see as its potential faults. And I realize you're not supposed to say anything by Lewis has faults, but okay. So, and the most underrated one, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say Experiment in Criticism, which is a C.S. Lewis book that probably the majority of Lewis fans have never read.
I have
It's
not.
kind of one of his more quote unquote academic books, but it's short. And it's a profound look at the art of reading and why reading is so essential and so important. And in one of my other books, I talk a lot about the power of empathy for the spiritual life and how important it is. And Lewis has probably some of the greatest thinking about how reading makes us more empathetic, and that empathy, when we see the world through others' eyes, our own vision and understanding of the world becomes larger.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot more I think we could go on talking about with this, but unfortunately, we are running low on time. And I wanted to be sure to save this question for you before we left.
Okay.
So, a little background for you. In the Anselm Society, I believe the two biggest Jane Austen fans are Brian Brown, our founder and president, and me. So, because the two biggest Jane Austen fans happen to be dudes, me and Brian have been talking about, going forward with this, maybe starting a Jane Austen Bros podcast, having merch and all that. But anyway, I couldn't help but notice that one of your prior works is called The Prayers of Jane Austen. So I'm really curious. Tell us a little bit about that. And do you want to join the Jane Austen Bros? We're open for membership.
I'm totally down with that. I have sometimes wondered if I am the only dude in the world who was a Jane Austen fan, but I mean, Jane Austen understood human psychology and the nature of what love is, the difference between real love and that false thing called charm, all of the prejudgment. Oh, I mean, there's so many beautiful themes. But so what happened is, when I chose some books for my book, 75 Masterpieces Every Christian Should Know, which is, art, music, literature, architecture, and film. I wanted to include Jane Austen. So, I went through and kind of reread most of her books. And in my research for the little chapter I wrote on her in the book, I discovered that there were a collection of prayers that she had written for her family devotions, something that they could all join together. And there are only like three prayers, but they were beautiful.
Wow.
And most people didn't even know they existed. And so I just asked the publisher. I said, "Would you be interested in making a little gift book of these prayers?" And so we decided that we would use art from the British Library that was of that period and scatter that throughout. And so we've turned it into a little prayer book, and it's actually one of my best-selling books. Is that little book, The Prayers of Jane Austen, and I love reading those prayers aloud. They're beautiful. They show her heart.
Awesome. That is so great to hear, and it's always good to find another Jane Austen bro. So, welcome officially to the club. And again, listeners, please check out both his previous works, like the Jane Austen prayers, but also his most recent book. Again, it is Not a Tame Lion: The Life, Teachings, and Legacy of C.S. Lewis by Terry Glaspey. Terry, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. I've been a fan at a distance of Anselm Society and what you guys do, and have thought at some point I need to get myself out to one of your events. I
absolutely.
love your
You are
vision,
one of us.
and So
Yes.
I was really pleased to see that I was going to get to talk to folks from Anslem. So
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was a privilege. And your website is terryglaspey.com.
Yep.
We'll have that in the show notes so people can look at all the other things that you wrote that we didn't get to talk about.
All right. If you ever want to talk about art someday, I'm happy to chat about that.
I think we'll be in touch.
Yes, I think so.
And listeners, as you can probably tell, things are winding down at the Anslem Society Digital Pub. The fire's down to embers, the customers are trundling home, and you've polished off your final glass. Once again, Believe to See is a podcast of the Anslem Society Arts Guild. If you have a few seconds to spare, please rate and review the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for listening, and we will catch you next time.